Hello, everyone. So we're delighted to have everybody here today. People have been dropping like flies, unfortunately, in Chicago this winter with the flu, including sadly the person whose brainchild this whole series is Naila. I'm not Naila Nasir. I'm David Figlio. I'm the Dean of the School of Education and Social Policy here at Northwestern. And for those of you who are not here, not on the Northwestern family, we're really happy that you came. I know that weather and illness have taken more than their fair share of toll this year. What I will say a couple words myself, and then I will read Naila's statement that she would have said instead. For me, as soon as Naila, I think she called me something on their second or third day on the job as the Spencer Foundation president and said, the Spencer Foundation is in Chicago, and I really want to make it much more of Chicago. And so what do you think, David, about having University of Chicago and UIC and Northwestern and Spencer all coming together and having a lecture series on important topics that we all can come together around to talk about? And so after bringing in Steve Raudenbush at University of Chicago and Al Tatum at UIC, we thought, wouldn't it be cool if we had this home and home and home series going to each of these three great universities, having scholars from different universities speaking and responding and starting a conversation up. And I just thought that's exactly the type of wonderful thing that our Chicago area intellectual community, that could really benefit our Chicago area intellectual community. So I was personally all in. And then I loved when we started to talk about who could be the very lead kickoff speaker in this new experiment. And there was Steve Raudenbush suggested his junior colleague, Robert Vargas. Well, of course, Robert is a graduate of the sociology department here at Northwestern. And was a student as a first-year graduate student, I think, in one of my classes, and the like. And I thought, what a remarkably wonderful way to start this series than to have somebody who's now, an up-and-coming extraordinary scholar at one of our universities, who graduated from another university, who's made his career, which has gotten off to a rocket-like start, all about research about Chicago. So we thought, well, this is just perfect. So we are so very grateful. Before I introduce Robert, I want to say to you, I'm very grateful that you were willing to be Dragon Slayer on this for this experiment. And of course, I get to say, oh, I knew him back when, right? So that's awesome. And so it's really, really a personal pleasure to welcome you back home to Northwestern so you can share your wisdom and your research and scholarship with us. All right, so let me now become Naila for a moment. Naila is so excited about this speaker series. It is the brainchild of myself and the staff at Spencer and three of our local deans and chairs, Al Tatum, David Figlio, and Steve Raudenbush. Our goal with this series is to support deeper relationships between education scholars from the amazing higher education institutions across Chicago. Okay, iterator reliability, so that's good. It's a city with vast intellectual riches around education scholarship, and we wanted to find ways to deepen the sense of community. Collaboration and community are kind of becoming themes at Spencer these days. So there are 3 talks in the series this year, each taking up a different topic in relation to the broader theme of understanding the complex ecology of students' lives and communities beyond school. Each talk will be hosted at a different institution so that we have official reason to go to one another's campuses. The next talk is April 3rd, and we have confirmed that UIC will host Professor Eve Tuck, who will be helping us think about models of research that are deeply respectful of communities. And on May 2nd, the University of Chicago will host Professor Jim Rosenbaum of Northwestern, who will focus on community college and school-to-work transitions in the face of a changing economy. We'll be sending out information on both of those talks soon, so look for that and share widely, please. Now, with no further ado, I will introduce today's speaker and respondents. Our speaker today is Professor Robert Vargas. He is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Sociology and founding director of the Violence, Law, and Politics Lab at the University of Chicago. His research examines how redistricting laws, bureaucracies, and public policies shape the condition of cities, with a particular focus on violence and healthcare. His talk today will focus on his award-winning book, Wounded City: Violent Turf Wars in a Chicago Barrio, which shows the relationship between ward boundary redistricting and block-level violence in the Little Village neighborhood of Chicago. The book has had rave reviews. Patrick Sharkey writes, "Wounded City is one of the most important books about urban violence that has been published in a long time. In a style that is engaging and insightful, Robert Vargas pushes the reader to consider why some communities are highly organized against violence, while others are not, and shows that the answer lies in the intersection between politics, institutions, and residents." And I think what is so special about this book is that it brings together an insightful analysis of the political context of the city of Chicago and how neighborhoods and blocks react and launch responses to neighborhood violence with varying degrees of success, dependent upon their access to power at the city level. In doing so, he reframes neighborhoods as active actors in pushing for neighborhood safety, while also illustrating with beautiful ethnographic detail the complex interrelationship between gangs and neighborhood folk. The issue of neighborhood violence is one that is obviously quite pressing and tragic in Chicago, and it's certainly a critical concern for educators and for schools. We look forward to a lively discussion. Our format today will be that Professor Vargas will speak for about 40 minutes. Then we will hear comments from each of 2 respondents. Nicole Wen is an assistant professor of social foundations of education at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Her work focuses on the intersections of national security, war, and U.S. public schooling. Emma Adam is professor of human development and social policy here at Northwestern. She is a developmental psychologist who I would have called you a psychoneuroendocrinologist. I'm going off script, who focuses on the implications of stress for child and adolescent behavioral, cognitive, and emotional development. Please join me in welcoming Professor Vargas to the stage. So do you want like a 5 or 10 minute warning or no?
No, I'm pretty
You're good?
Okay. I have a timer right here.
All right, 40 minutes.
Got it. All right. Well, it's great to be back home. I have so many great memories here. I still have the slides and lecture notes from David's statistics course, actually, that I refer back to whenever I need a guidance on regression or regression discontinuity. So it's a pleasure to be back here and to share with you some of the fruit of the skills that I learned while I was here. This talk has past, present, and future elements of my research agenda in it. And so it's going to weave in and out of several projects, but overall answer this question of why redistricting can mean life or death in Chicago. And I'd like to start with the case study of the Little Village neighborhood. The neighborhood ranks among the top 10 most violent in the city. And I set out to put myself in the shoes of Chicagoans to simply learn what was being done on the ground to stop the violence. With support from the NSF, I hired a research team to canvass 60 randomly selected blocks of the neighborhood, predominantly Mexican neighborhood with a high violent crime rate. We used iPods to administer surveys and paid people $20 for participating. We also interviewed residents and took field notes from street observations. Again, I wanted to know what was being done to try and stop the violence. According to many existing theories, I should have found hopelessness, cynicism, and a lack of collective action or collective efficacy amongst residents. Even the mayor of Chicago has insisted that residents in violence-plagued neighborhoods need to do more to prevent violence, saying, quote, "The first line in protecting a neighborhood is the community, not the police." But after speaking with 710 residents, I quickly learned that residents made spirited and courageous efforts to stop the violence on every block, but that politics mediated their efforts. For example, when I canvassed blocks on the neighborhood's west side, I met residents who worked with landlords to evict gang members, lobby aldermen for resources, called police, and signed petitions to close liquor stores. Local politicians worked closely with nonprofits and residents to keep violence under control. But when I canvassed blocks just a half-mile to the east, the picture was entirely different. Residents were less likely to even open their doors. Shootings occurred more frequently on these blocks. Politicians were unresponsive to residents' demands, and nonprofits were just not visible. Efforts to understand violence have neglected local government's role in facilitating or impeding collective action. For my book, Wounded City, I spent 6 years working to unpack this puzzle, starting off with this question of why is violence concentrated in some blocks over others? Answering this required more than just residents' perspectives. I needed to understand how nonprofits, aldermen, gangs, and police were embedded in Chicago's broader political structure. So if a resident complained about the lack of resources on their block, I made sure to get to know the organizers and the aldermen on their blocks and the police officers working the beats in the area as I did the residents themselves. So after canvassing for a year, I spent 2 more years eating meals with community organizers, shadowing violence prevention workers, playing basketball with gang members, speaking with police officers, attending public hearings where politicians spoke and allocated resources, as well as digging through archives at the Chicago Historical Museum. And so let me begin piecing together all of these different strands with the statistical data. So when you break down Little Village into census tracts, the violent crime was concentrated in 3 general areas of the neighborhood, 2 of which were on the east side. All of the areas in the white and light gray on this map have violent crime rates that are actually lower than the city average. Violence in the only west side hotspot was high, but it was actually declining at the time I was doing this research, while violence in the 2 east side areas was on the rise. This graph shows violent crime rates of the 2 east side tracts in the light and the dark shades of blue, compared to the city average in pink. And these data come from the Chicago Homicide Database and the City of Chicago's Urban Data Portal. Violence in the east side hotspots has been steadily on the rise since 1965, whereas virtually all other areas of the neighborhood have seen declines, much like the city has seen a decline in violence since the 1990s. It turns out that these geographic patterns are not just true for Little Village. It's true for the city as a whole. This map shows the locations of all homicides from a 2-year time period, 2015 and 2016. Violence is concentrated in pockets of blocks within neighborhoods. And despite declines in the citywide rate of violent crime, some of these small areas haven't benefited from the crime drop. So to understand Chicago's geography of violence, we need to dig deeper and understand how violence becomes concentrated at the block level in smaller areas within neighborhoods of Chicago. And my book, Wounded City, uses the case of Little Village to develop a framework for understanding block by block violence. And it's built on 2 features. First, studying neighborhoods as fields instead of ecologies. Whereas ecological approaches focus on the physical conditions of neighborhoods, a field approach, in the spirit of social theorist Pierre Bourdieu, focuses our attention to power relations, the actors, relationships, and events that trigger or mediate violent conflict. Criminologists like Andy Papachristos have emphasized a similar approach, arguing for violence researchers to study dominance relations amongst gang members that lead to the diffusion of homicide within networks. My field approach builds upon this network approach towards gangs by expanding our understanding of power to a wider array of actors engaged in dominance relations. For example, a field approach allows us to recognize that on city blocks, gangs are not the only groups competing for turf. Politicians fight over blocks' ward designation, businesses lobby for areas to become tax increment financing districts, and so on. With a field approach, violence is not simply the outcome of a neighborhood effect or gang wars, it's also the outcome of conflict or collaboration among political actors competing for control over city blocks. The second feature is my use of mixed methods. I interviewed and observed residents, violence prevention workers, police officers, politicians, and gang members as they either collaborated or competed to trigger or prevent violence block by block. Then, triangulated with spatial and time series data to connect the ethnographic observations with rates of violence at the block and census tract level. So by observing relationships on the ground and statistical patterns across 60 randomly selected blocks in the neighborhood, I observed how the strategic actions of these actors varied block by block, triggering violence on some while preventing it on others. This approach led me to discover what I call two kinds of turf wars that concentrated violence in the specific hotspots within Little Village. The first was political turf wars, or relationships between political actors inside and outside the neighborhood that shaped blocks' capacity to acquire violence prevention resources. The second was street turf wars between gangs and police whose competition for the social control of blocks triggered shootings and arsons. So in my fieldwork, the violence that I saw concentrated on the east side was the product of conflicts and collaborations amongst numerous actors engaged in a competition for power. So let me visualize this for you. This map of the neighborhood shows the violent hotspots in blue. And to explain this concentration, most researchers would fixate on gang turf. And Little Village surely had its fair share of gang turf. It was occupied by the 2-6, Latin Kings, the 2-2 Boys, and the Satan Disciples. Many scholars would look at this map and conclude that the violence is due to dominance relations amongst gangs over turf, or a lack of collective efficacy, and there's truth to this, but it's not the whole picture. By focusing exclusively on gangs or illicit spaces, existing theories cannot explain why some blocks had more power and resources to mediate gang disputes than others. We can measure the effects of political power on violent hotspots by studying political turf. Ward boundaries cut through neighborhoods. In Chicago, the city is divided into 50 wards whose representatives advocate for resources on a neighborhood's behalf. Little Village's west side is represented by the 22nd ward, while the east side is gerrymandered, split into the 12th, 24th, and 28th wards. Fieldwork with politicians and nonprofits revealed that these ward boundaries were the result of a decades-long political battle between different factions of the city's mainstream Democratic Party. This is the same map from the previous slide, just zoomed out to show you the full extent of the gerrymandering. Political turf is critical for understanding the concentration of violence within neighborhoods because it illuminates how some blocks acquire the political power and resources necessary to reduce violence over others. To illustrate this point, I begin with a story from a block on the west side located by the star on the map. This is where rates of violence were on the decline. It was July of 2010, which is crazy to think that was 8 years ago. The World Cup of soccer was taking place in South Africa at the time, so we canvassed during game times to have a greater chance of catching people while they were home. But on that day, few people were answering their doors. A group of 8 Latin King gang members were congregated in front of a house. Santiago, a resident, finally answered and told me that there was a shooting here yesterday, but nobody had got hit. The Kings and 2-6 had been going back and forth, shooting at one another for the past week. As I continued canvassing, a gang member approached me and asked what me and my research assistant were doing. I told him, we're conducting surveys of neighborhood youth in Little Village. Are you between 14 and 18? No, he said, but my guy has some kids that age, and he leads us over to a house, and this tall guy comes out named Jake. He has this teardrop tattoo on his face, And after we explained the study to him, he brings out his daughters. And I was speaking with Jake as his daughters were taking the survey. And he says to me, there was a shooting exactly where you're standing 24 hours ago. We were chilling here and some 2-6 came by and shot at us. We hit them up yesterday and we're waiting for them to come back. And I asked him, you guys aren't afraid of standing out here? And he said, no, we're ready for them. And so before Jake could continue, we were interrupted by a car that was slowly pulling up. All the gang members stared intently, but everyone let their guard down after seeing that the car was driven by Art, shown here in the picture to the right. Art was a violence prevention worker for a local nonprofit, an ex-gang member working to reduce violence. He yells out of his car, hey, the roof of my brother's garage came down this morning. I need a bunch of guys to help with the cleanup. Can you guys help me out? After hesitating, Jake nodded to the group standing on the corner. 4 gang members piled into Art's car and drove off. The remaining gang members walked away. And after Jake's daughters completed the surveys, we got out of there as quickly as possible, too. A few weeks later, I ran into Art at his organization's headquarters and asked whether or not he got his brother's garage fixed, and he laughed at me, saying, I wasn't trying to get a garage fixed. I was trying to get those guys off the corner where the 2-6 were about to come back and shoot them up. So by asking the group of gang members for help, Art got them off the block where they were prime targets for a retaliatory shooting. Because of Art's intervention, the block went from a hot spot to a cold spot. To be clear, shootings and homicides still plague the west side of the neighborhood, but nonprofits like the one that Art worked for, and shown here on the map to the white houses, nonprofits in the west side worked incessantly to prevent small gang beefs or conflicts from spiraling into retaliatory shootings. These nonprofits were plentiful on the neighborhood's west side because, in part, through their relationships to politicians in the 22nd Ward, who funneled contracts, jobs, grants, and resources. As one organizer explained to me, quote, good relations with local political leaders is critical for violence prevention. If you don't have many political relationships, you ain't gonna do much, period. That's the name of the game, that's the city we live in. The administration of violence prevention resources was concentrated within wards because nonprofits needed political ties to get resources. And in exchange for this funding, nonprofits prioritized serving local politicians' turf first to help ensure that that ward leader would get reelected. So as I continued canvassing and mapped these concentration of nonprofits, I tried to make sense of why the 22nd Ward had so many resources. And this is where the historical research comes in, because it revealed the importance of a political turf war that spans decades, and is in many ways is still ongoing today. If we were to go back in time, 40 years to 1977, the 22nd Ward, the west side of Little Village, would look completely different. It had no Latino political leadership, no Latino serving nonprofits. The alderman was a white Democrat named Frank Stemberg, who was hostile towards the neighborhood's Mexican newcomers. The 22nd Ward was part of Chicago's classic political machine, led by Mayor Richard J. Daley, who used this alliance with city council representatives throughout the city to get out the vote for presidential candidates or the more mainstream Democratic candidates. And so, excluded by the machine, Black and Latino activists in the 1980s created an alliance that helped increase the number of independents in the city council. They helped elect Harold Washington, mayor of Chicago, and alum of Northwestern. Jesus Garcia, shown here on the left, was elected as the 22nd Ward's first Latino alderman in 1986. Today, the 22nd Ward has continued to be a base of progressive Latino politicians. Jesus Garcia will go on to become a state senator, a Cook County commissioner, mount a serious challenge to Mayor Rahm Emanuel in 2015. Now he's running for Congress to replace Luis Gutierrez. Ricardo Munoz has been alderman of the 22nd Ward for over 20 years now. These political leaders were critical for bringing resources to Little Village's west side. They connected nonprofits with state agencies and foundations to secure grants for programs like ceasefire, after-school programs, and job programs. And so the resources that I observed in Little Village's 22nd Ward were the result of winning hard-fought political turf wars for power, resources, or a seat at the table in Chicago City Council. These turf wars, however, had a far different outcome in the east side of Little Village. In the early 80s, the city council passed ward redistricting ordinances that gerrymandered Black and Latino neighborhoods throughout the city. This included Little Village's east side. So in 1975, the 25th ward, which covered the east side of Little Village, was majority white. The alderman was an Italian by the name of Vito Marzullo, shown here in the photo. By 1983, however, Latinos outnumbered the Italians in his ward, and Marzullo feared that residents would elect a Latino candidate to replace him. And so here the different colored polygons represent the different wards, and Little Village is outlined in the white. Marzullo and the city council redrew the 25th ward's boundary so that it had fewer Latino Little Village residents. The East Side's Latino population was now split into 3 wards, where whites or blacks were the majority and where Latinos no longer had a majority. This prevented the East Side of Little Village from becoming another politically independent ward like the 22nd ward. While the West Side remained relatively stable over the past 40 to 50 years, the gerrymandering has continued on the East Side through redistricting in 1995, 2005, and 2015. We like to think voters choose our elected officials, but when it comes to redistricting in Chicago, elected officials choose their voters. In Little Village's east side, the city's democratic machine manipulated ward boundaries to disenfranchise a growing political threat. In 1983, several Black and Latino leaders won a lawsuit against the city's ward redistricting ordinance, and the court mandated the creation of 7 majority-minority wards throughout the city. And Little Village's 22nd ward was one of those 7 wards in that lawsuit, which helps to explain why it was relatively stable in this time period. But the court order didn't undo the gerrymandered areas in other parts of the city. To this day, gerrymandering continues throughout much of the US at different levels of government because dominant political parties refuse to change the redistricting process. Gerrymandering severely undermined East Side residents' ability to acquire violence prevention resources because unlike the West Side, where Little Village residents constituted 85% of constituents, East Side residents constituted less than 3% of voters in the 12th ward, the 28th ward, and the 24th ward. So aldermen in these areas had very little incentive to respond to residents' requests because there would be very little political consequences due to the sheer low number of voters. The gerrymandered political turf in the East Side led the East Side to having fewer resources, but being also more dangerous than the West Side. I didn't observe violence prevention workers on these streets. Instead, the East Side was the site of an unregulated street turf war amongst the gangs and the police, which often triggered violence. And so in the absence of ties to politicians or nonprofits, disenfranchised residents resorted to developing direct ties to gang members to try and protect themselves. The social order of the East Side was centered on a code of silence where residents refrained from reporting gang activities to police, and in exchange, the gang would leave residents alone. The police, however, routinely disrupted this social order by triggering violent retaliation against residents who reported crimes committed by the gang. So when canvassing an East Side block, I met Anna, who had reported a group of gang members on her block holding guns. And that night, the Latin Kings set her home on fire. I sat with her in her living room as she recalled the day, and after they threw the Molotov cocktail at her house, the gang members yelled, "This is the bitch who calls the cops. Next time, don't call them because we own them. They told us you called." When I asked her what led her to believe that the police had intentionally informed on her to the gangs, she responded, "How else could it be? I didn't tell anyone else about it. I asked around the neighborhood." And so I asked around the neighborhood to make sense of her claim. Sure enough, Freddy, a violence prevention worker, explained to me, "You got to understand, some of the Latin Kings have police scanners. Not just any scanner, but the actual police scanner. So when cops talk to each other, they can hear the caller's name or address. The gangs were using police-issued scanners to monitor police radio communication and at times overhear informant addresses disclosed by dispatchers. My interviews with gang members and police confirmed that gangs were in fact subverting the police, and the details are in the book. But after collecting these data, I downloaded an iPhone app called Chicago Scanners, which any of you can download for free on your phones, on your smartphones, which gives a live feed to select police radio channels directly to your phone. I wanted to listen for myself and see if I could figure out the location of people reporting crimes to police. So in one call, I heard an officer responding to a shooting, and after a few minutes, he says to the dispatcher, "The area is clear. I knocked on 2642 South May, but nobody is saying they made the call. Do you have an address on the caller?" After 2 minutes, the dispatcher says, "Yes, 2648 South May." As you can see, it's relatively easy to discern a caller's address. And in an article that I currently have out for review, I had a research assistant transcribe 60 hours of audio from police radio communication across 3 police zones. Zone 4 is predominantly white, which covers the Gold Coast area, near North Side. Zone 13 is predominantly Latino, which covers Bridgeport, back of the yards. And Zone 8 is a predominantly African American zone. And so what did we find? We found that about 1 out of 10 calls made in the black police zone disclosed the caller's name or address. This was similar in the Latino police zone, while we did not find a single instance of police disclosing info on callers in the predominantly white police radio zone. So all this to say is that this pattern is broader and beyond Little Village. So in Little Village, the disclosure of caller identities over these open-air frequencies was triggering violent conflict between residents and gangs, resulting actually in a higher number of arsons in the neighborhood. Arson was the primary mechanism, violent mechanism, that the gangs used to retaliate against callers. And all the crosses on the map show the location of aggravated arsons in Little Village during my time conducting fieldwork from 2010 to 2012. Only 5 occurred on the west side, while 19 occurred in the east. As political turf wars severely undermined residents' ability to acquire violence prevention resources, the turf wars between gangs and police had turned the east side into an arson hotspot. Police also triggered shootings in the east side when they arrested the leader of the 22 Boys street gang. While canvassing blocks on the east side, I had met residents who claimed that their block had undergone an unprecedented rise in violence ever since the local gang leader was arrested on drug charges. And this is where being in David's regression differences and differences class paid off. I thought, oh, hey, if I pulled off monthly shootings, I could be able to see if there's a spike before and after the event. And sure enough, there is. There's a spike in reported shootings in the month after the arrest. The block had not seen such a surge in reported shootings since 2008, and this spike was 5 times higher than the city average in the red line below, and the average of similar gang territories in adjacent neighborhoods and similar neighborhoods, which I use as a quasi-control group. So after crunching these numbers, I re-entered these blocks to talk to gang members and try to learn what unfolded after the gang leader's arrest. And so the stars on the map show the locations of the shootings. What had essentially happened was that the crackdown on the 22 Boys created this area of vacant territories, and then the 2 major gangs on the east and to the west converged on the area for the turf, trying to claim it, and the shootings erupted as a result. And I should also add here that this likely underestimates the amount of violence that happened, because the only reason why these were reported was because innocent bystanders had been shot, and it was gang members, because usually a lot of gangs don't report on one another. So to bring this all back together, the political turf wars over Little Village can help explain why the east side did not have intervention workers to mediate these kind of gang conflicts in the way that I had seen happen on the ground in the west side. Instead, the police were the only organization with a presence in the streets, and stuck having to fulfill the role of a social worker, mental health professional, counselor, and of course law enforcer. This was far bigger, far larger of a task than the police could do on their own. This pattern of violence being concentrated in politically disenfranchised, fragmented areas of the city is not unique to Little Village. This clip that I'm about to show to you shows change in Chicago's ward boundaries from 1961 through today. The neighborhoods in red have had the most homicides in Chicago over the past 2 years. And so the clip is going to play on a loop. So it's not going to stop, but I want you to fix your eyes on one neighborhood at a time. Pay attention to how often the ward boundaries change. Violence-plagued neighborhoods, both Black and Latino, have been politically disenfranchised and divided for decades. Descriptively, 44% of Chicago's homicides in the past 2 years have occurred in these gerrymandered areas. Now let's reverse the gaze and see how ward boundaries change in some of Chicago's more affluent areas. Again, the video is going to play on a loop, so fix your eyes on one neighborhood at a time. Here we have from north to south, Norwood, yeah, it's all labeled, Edison Park, West Ridge, Bridgeport. Notice how in Bridgeport and Beverly, these neighborhoods have had the exact same stable political representation since 1960, over 50 years. Let that sink in a little. Think of all the resources, stability, all the political relationships these communities have benefited from over the past 40 years. Now imagine what Little Village, Inglewood, or Austin might look like if these communities had such stability and a stable connection to resources. Aldermen might be held accountable for their neglect of blocks with high rates of violence. Residents like Cindy might not have to strike a deal with gangs to be safe. The police might not be the only solution to reducing violence in some of the most problematic areas. And so to clarify for all of the causal inference folks in the room, I'm not saying that gerrymandering causes violence yet. With the support of an NSF Career Award, I have a lab of students digitizing homicide archives and historical maps to model the effects of redistricting on block-level homicide in Chicago, dating all the way back to the city's first ward maps in 1837. I'm also conducting similar analyses with archives in New Orleans and San Francisco, so stay tuned. Merely, I share these visualizations to convey that descriptively, the pattern of geographical political disenfranchisement and violence is not unique to Little Village. So the story that I'm telling is not one that is one of one neighborhood. It's unfolded across the city and thus points to necessary new directions in urban violence research in Chicago, as well as more broadly, new directions on redistricting research. These are maps of gerrymandered congressional districts in North Carolina and Texas, as well as wards in Philadelphia. Redistricting is often thought as having primarily effects on political outcomes, like election results. And my project raises broader questions and possibilities of redistricting effects beyond elections to resource allocation. And this is an area of research that I would love to see more work on in the future. And so I would like to conclude by discussing some concrete implications for sociological research, as well as policy implications for Chicago's violence problem. So my field approach offers 3 ways to move forward on research in this area. First, studying political turf wars suggests focusing not just on where violence is geographically, but also where political power and resources for violence prevention are concentrated. Political field dynamics leave footprints like a gerrymandered neighborhood or a clustering of nonprofits in an area. The study of political turf forces us to ask different questions, like, are violence prevention resources distributed to areas that need them most? And if not, then why? Second, studying the configuration of political turf can bring clarification to the relationship between race and violent crime that has puzzled many criminologists. To avoid pathologizing racial minority communities, Rob Sampson and Bill Wilson have argued that racial differences in neighborhood violent crime stem from the different ecological conditions of Black and white neighborhoods. And while that's certainly true, my work also suggests an additional factor here, an additional story, which is that Black and Latino neighborhoods are governed in different ways compared to white neighborhoods. If we want to better understand the role of race in generating spatial inequality, my work suggests we should pay attention to the way that governors, mayors, city councils allocate resources and distribute power to Black, white, and Latino communities. Third, the political framework opens up the possibility for interventions at the institutional level. At the moment, sociology is following the lead of economics and public health, no offense, by informing interventions aimed at changing individual behavior. A field approach allows for a more institutional approach to violence prevention, one that focuses on things like redistricting reform, or increased police oversight, or reforming the city council. Finally, with respect to policy, I'd like to end on a somewhat more positive note, which is to say that I think we're a lot closer to reducing violence than many of us think. I think Pat Sharkey's book on the crime decline helps to tell this story. A lot of progress has been made. And from a scientific standpoint, we know a lot more than we did in the past. For example, we know from the crime lab at UChicago that job programs reduce kids' likelihood of committing violence, and that the city has introduced a number of summer job programs for at-risk youth, and this has been evaluated to show positive effects. The police department uses social network data and algorithms on gangs to identify potential victims of violence and giving them the opportunity to get off the streets before they become a potential victim or before they themselves commit an act of violence. Nonprofits are implementing street intervention programs like the one I described, ART being involved in, that prevent violent retaliations between gang members. There's no single solution to the violence problem. We need a multi-pronged approach, and to that end, much progress has been made. My work sheds light on the political turf wars that are undermining these great interventions. So in addition to the gerrymandering, state funds for ceasefire and other interventions were frozen for about 2 to 3 years due to the state budget impasse, sparked in part through the tension between Governor Bruce Rauner and Illinois House Speaker Mike Madigan on the Democratic side that couldn't agree to pass a budget for 2 or 3 years, and as a result, violence prevention organizations were frozen. In addition, the mayor's inadequate response to police killings has entirely undermined the police department's legitimacy in communities of color. This has made it extraordinarily difficult to develop the trust and collaboration necessary to prevent violence. And so to really drive this point home, in 2015, the city of Chicago spent $500 million to settle police abuse lawsuits, whereas the operating budget of Ceasefire Chicago that year was $106.5 million. You just can't justify this on any moral, political, or economic grounds. The most important thing I want to accomplish with this talk is to help you understand a critical missing dimension of the discussion going on with respect to violence in Chicago, which is the political turf wars between the dispossessed and the powerful that determine who gets what. Thanks for your time. If you want to see those visualizations of the ward boundaries, you could look them up at my lab's website. They're posted there. I'm going to have to leave shortly after the talk, so I might not get the chance to answer any questions, so feel free to email me. Thanks for your time.
So you can see why we at Northwestern are so proud of Robert. He really exemplifies the type of mixed methods, policy relevant, deep scholar that we hope there are a number of Northwestern graduate students in the audience. No pressure for you guys, but we're really thrilled to have you back here. And also, he's on his way to Austin to give a big invited speech, so it was really generous of him to be able to come here en route to the airport. Our two respondents, Emma and Nicole, will each speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have time for a moderated Q&A, and then we can have refreshments. So, Emma, I think you're up first, right?
And I'm going to do my slides from here. So thank you very much. This seems very loud. Is it very loud? Should we get rid of it? Move it down. So thank you very much, Robert, for that fascinating talk and the fascinating book as well, which I really enjoyed. You've told us how political turf wars and redistricting cause pockets of violence in particular blocks, in particular neighborhoods. And I wanted to highlight how some of that, how that may have consequences for youth well-being and for educational outcomes, connecting this back to education. So some of my research highlights the fact that nearby violence affects youth behavior and biology in ways that matter for both health and academic performance, even for youth that aren't directly involved in the incident. And so in one study in a large Midwestern city somewhere near here, we studied 82 youth, and we compared several biological variables, sleep timing and quality, as well as stress hormone levels measured with cortisol, on the night and day following a violent crime nearby to that youth. And we compared that to youth's typical levels of sleep and stress hormone levels on other days. And so this was a within-person design where we're comparing, where we're looking at stress hormones and sleep quality and hours immediately following a crime as compared to other days for that same individual. We measured sleep objectively using actigraphy, a wrist-based monitor that measures activity level, from which we can look at sleep timing, and we measured cortisol, which is a stress hormone, from small samples of saliva that we took 3 times a day for 4 days from the youth. And what we found is that youth went to bed later by about 26 minutes and had shorter sleep the night following a violent crime. They also had the next morning stress hormone levels that were nearly double the levels that for days that didn't follow a violent crime. And of concern, I should say that of kind of interest to the geographical focus of your research, Robert, effect sizes were larger the closer the crime was to the individual's particular home, and also effect sizes were larger the more violent the type of crime. And so, for example, for a nearby homicide, adolescents slept 1.8 hours less per night on the nights following a homicide. And I should say we carefully controlled for day of week. This isn't just a Saturday night effect. And this is concerning for a number of reasons. And this is just a model showing you kind of a rough model showing links between neighborhood context, including local kind of block context, acute stress exposure, with the acute exposure to stress and violence causing changes in cortisol and sleep, which in turn have implications for executive functioning, which is a form of cognitive control that's important for educational outcomes, and in turn has implications for academic achievement. So in various other studies that I don't have time to talk about today, we're putting together all the different pieces of this model to show links between various forms of stress, including violence and academic outcomes, by way of these changes in stress biology. So the block level variations, and we write more about it in these theoretical models as well if you're interested in reading more about these models. So the block level variation described by Dr. Vargas in his talk has potentially important implications for nearby youth getting under the skin to affect biology in ways that may contribute to disparities in youth health as well as youth academic outcomes. And in our Q&A, maybe we can talk a little more about actions. There's really two groups of policy and individual actions that I think we can take. One is to protect youth from acute violent crime exposure, and we can talk about ways to do that, including the many political actions that Robert talked about, as well as generally improving youth feelings of safety and security. The biological systems I study are threat systems, but they're also systems that are very responsive to feelings of safety. And so anything we can do, even in the face of violent crime, to improve youth feelings of safety will have positive outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you also for your talk. As a geographer of education, I really appreciate the multi-scalar analysis you conducted of Little Village, as well as the ethnographic exploration of the social forces that concentrate violence on certain blocks. And we know that Chicago is lived and made block by block, so I really appreciate you sort of getting inside of how Chicago is made block by block. And you ask specifically, how could blocks in the same neighborhood and located just 1 mile apart have such different levels of organization for preventing violence? And you provide insight into how the acquisition of political power on the west side of Little Village helped funnel resources to blocks in need, while the sort of gerrymandering on the east side sort of prevented and stymied the accumulation of that political power needed to prevent violence. And towards the end of your book, you argue that researchers need to identify the small clusters of blocks within neighborhoods that account for the majority of violent crimes and work to integrate the people living in those areas with city government and nonprofit agencies working to prevent violence. So my comments are sort of organized around sort of that brief summary. And I'll say that I began reading your book, Wounded City, when Chicago announced that it would close or phase out the last remaining public schools in Englewood. And so for me, these school closings reveal yet again how the state or the city is actually engineering conflict. And we can see this in how Englewood children have to now will have to commute long distances to Gage Park and other neighborhoods, crossing all kinds of boundaries and lines in a context of chronic disinvestment that's mired in the state destruction of community spaces like public schools. And when the city planned to and eventually closed 50 neighborhood schools across the city of Chicago, parents actually warned elected officials that those closings would increase violence across the city. But instead of not closing those schools, the city invested in safe passage routes. And those school closures primarily affected Black schools, Black communities, and Black teachers. And so the city decided we'll funnel millions of dollars into the safe passage program that essentially the routes that children walk to school are now just lined with street watchers to ensure children can get to and from school safely. And each year the city expands the safe passage program, which I read as a stopgap measure by the city to stop the violence it itself has created through school closures and chronic disinvestment. So given this ongoing state violence in both its spectacular and mundane forms that then generate neighborhood level violence, from the killing of Laquan McDonald to the destruction of quality of life institutions to school closures to, of course, gerrymandering, which you document, I'm really trying to think through the centrality of electoral politics, seeking political office and formal political power as a central strategy in violence prevention, especially when the U.S. political establishment has created the need for violence prevention programs that you've discussed. And this might get at the sort of multi-pronged approach that you alluded to at the end of your talk. So your approach looks at how different relationships and access to political power shape a neighborhood's capacity to prevent violence, drawing from the public health model that views violence as a disease that spreads. Your discussion, for me, read alongside the Englewood school closings, makes me think of the source of violence, so not just the spread, but the actual source of violence, and the state or the city's political establishment's role in producing that violence. And so we're sort of appealing to a city that continuously engineers conflict to prevent conflict. And so I'm trying to think through sort of that conundrum that's presented for us. And of course, gerrymandering is a creation and source of violence that also impedes violence prevention programs, which you document in your book. So Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor actually argues that after decades of pursuing political office and an electoral strategy, Black elected officials have been unable to alter the poverty, unemployment, housing, and food insecurity that Black constituents face which casts significant doubt on the existing electoral system as a viable vehicle for Black liberation, particularly since racial progress in the US has always been propelled by the strength of the mass movement of ordinary people of color, rather than elected officials from slavery to mass incarceration. You demonstrate, for example, how competition over political power forced government leaders running for mayor to support extreme policing rather than alternative strategies with a proven track record, meaning in some ways that the price of admission into the US political arena is consenting to extreme policing and harsh violence suppression tactics rather than community-based solutions that address the systemic roots of violence. And more recently in Chicago, the older people of color have supported the proposal to build a $95 million police academy, while communities of color have called for the distribution of those public funds, $95 million, to public education, healthcare facilities, and job opportunities as the fundamental means to build and sustain healthy, safe, and livable communities. So we're seeing a disconnect between elected officials and ordinary people produced by some of these power struggles that you've documented, as well as economic constraints and political pressures for sort of a law and order, tough on crime approach to violence prevention. And so Angela Davis argued during the Obama years, we can't rely on governments, regardless of who is in power, to do the work that only mass movements can do. So I'm now going to selfishly ask you a question since I'm sitting here and you're sitting here. Given what you learned in Little Village, I would love if during the Q&A session you can talk a little bit more about the tension between the state's role both in engineering, creating, being the source of conflict, and also a space to prevent or a resource to prevent that violence, and what this might mean for how neighborhoods strategically mobilize for access to political power that addresses these multiple dimensions of violence. And of course, I suspect, like me, you see this as a sort of both and rather than an either or, to see the enormous contributions, during the sort of Harold Washington era, the Chewy era, as very important moments in sort of political struggle within Chicago. But we see similar tensions within all kinds of struggles for queer liberation, where you have state-recognized gay marriage as an important victory, but not addressing the chronic violence that queer youth of color face regularly, homelessness, lack of access to jobs, the same with sort of indigenous struggles, gaining access to legal recognition and treaties, but not necessarily changing their everyday conditions. And so for me, I just have this pressing question of how do we think about the limits and possibilities of gaining access to political power in the ways that Chewy and Harold Washington were able to do that for the west side of Little Village, but also its limitations, which we see in the east side of Little Village. And what does this tell us about how we organize to gain access to that political power?
Great. Well, thank you both for your really great comments. Emma, I would just say real quickly that I was motivated to enter the field precisely because of how much trauma I was observing from amongst the kids. So all of what you had found, I could have very much written a book along those lines. And so I think the two merge very in an unfortunately, in a good, sound way or logical way. I've given a lot of thought to your question, and I think I would start by saying that overall, I feel like for the most part, political leaders want to do something about the violence problem. And what I see is a system, a political structure that is this zero-sum game where in order to win, someone else has to lose. And I think that to get to the point of building the collective action to do something about this problem requires bringing people to the table who have historically been opposed to one another and getting them to realize that they're playing by the rules of a game that's undermining what they share in common, what their common goals are. And that's tough, because I remember giving a talk at the Chicago Community Trust where there were some folks in the audience, and the level of bitterness, particularly, I hate to say, between the Black and the Latino community, in part because there's interracial politics there, where there's tension of right, because there's a declining Black population, And as a result, there's some that are arguing that because blacks are constituting less of a share of the city, Latinos should actually get more representation. But as you can imagine, right, that's a very difficult, sensitive conversation to have. But that's where you see, like, well, I tried to come in and try to think, guys, this is a zero-sum game that in part is designed this way to like create this competition. And so I think it starts by having, I think, these kinds of settings to put all this out there, you know, to try to reduce the amount of name calling and to just put it out there and say that, like, how can we think of a way of a city power structure that isn't a zero-sum game. In other words, how can we make a coalition or a group that's too big to fail? I think is a way of thinking about how to move forward. Like I think about the banks and the banking industry, right? Like they all team together so that they're too big to fail and they can do all sorts of things together, right? It's like, well, what if we did the same kind of logic with, you know, the political groups in the city?
I realize we applauded Emma, but we didn't get a chance to applaud Nicole first. So I want to thank all three of you for kicking off the stimulating conversation. And so we have some time before refreshments. So we have a microphone that's moving around, right? So it would be great also if people could identify themselves. So especially we can hear if there's representation from multiple universities.
Right. Well, welcome back, Robert. This is Gary Fine from Sociology here at Northwestern. I'm proud to have known Robert back when. And I think I should point out that Robert joined us from DePaul. And perhaps in the future, we can also include DePaul and Loyola, even Chicago State, as part of this. But that's another conversation. The question that I had has to do with the very powerful argument that you made about aldermanic gerrymandering. And Chicago is a city which, in some sense, is described as a city with 51 mayors. The mayor and then the 50 aldermen who are mayors of their aldermanic districts. And what I was wondering about was whether your claims about redistricting apply also to the state legislative districts or the congressional districts where there isn't that same kind of relationship with neighborhoods. And here you can think of Gutierrez's district, which is certainly a very gerrymandered district that, you know, is described sometimes as earmuffs. You know, the Humboldt Park and then Little Village area, and whether the same issues apply on other political levels.
Yeah, that's a great question that I've thought about. I don't know enough about how resources are distributed at the state congressional level and at the U.S. congressional level to be able to say. I've been really curious about that. Just haven't had the time to dig into it. My sense is that that's probably true in some places, but not others. I think that there's some states where, due to because as a result of federalism, right, we know that there's so much state by state, city by city variation and how resources and power structures are created. So the short answer is I don't know. I suspect that there are some, which is why in the book and even with this talk, I would be very cautious with interpreting this as, you know, a definitive case of redistricting having effects on particular outcomes. Instead, I would say that the broader takeaway here is to look at systems of resource distribution and power distribution. That could be redistricting in some places. There are, for example, some cities where they have at-large city council members where there aren't actual drawn-out ward boundaries. And so in that case, it's not as much of a spatial story. And so, you know, this gets to the power of ethnography, of generalizing to ideas and to theory. And so to get people to think more broadly of how structures of power matter for the spatial configuration of problems. I hope to get at that question through the work I'm doing at the lab.
I love your talk, and I was involved in the independent political movement in the past. And I remember
IPO,
Rudy
yeah.
Lozano, and I just was wondering about a question regarding the difference in the policing methods in the 22nd Ward. In theory, where you have, was there a difference? I guess is my question, and the role of the police in all of this is fascinating to me. And if you had any comments on the spike in shootings in 2016 with regard to the Laquan McDonald video and the police stop and frisk and the whole debate that's occurred in, that weird up spike in violence that we've occurred, and I know you guys are studying it at U of C. But I guess what I'm wondering is, does the aldermanic control affect the actual policing effort?
It can. What I saw happening with the police and the various community groups in the 22nd Ward was that you had open communication channels where, in many senses, the alderman would help facilitate the relationships between the police commander and the nonprofit groups. Because what happens in a lot of low-income, high-violent crime neighborhoods is that there's a ton of turnover at the commander level of the district, and which makes it hard to maintain a stable relationship. And so the alderman played an important part of brokering those relationships. And what I saw unfold in many instances was nonprofit leaders, in some ways, through their relationships with the commander, keeping the police at a distance whenever they needed to prevent violence, and only calling the police in the most extreme cases whenever there was an instance where they had tried everything and they know that they just need to lock someone up.
This wasn't about closing cases and actually catching shooters in one area versus the other. I mean, it's the same low police closure rate as in all through there, right?
Yeah, it's very wishy-washy once you get into that fine-grained. When you see what's going on at the ground. I'll give you an example. There, in the West Side, where violent crime was low, there were instances where there wouldn't necessarily be a shooting, but there'd be a beating where someone got beat down pretty bad. But because it was settled through the nonprofit organizers, it won't show up as a violent crime. Does that mean necessarily that violent crime is going down in the neighborhood is an open question. But that, which is why I think, it's not just a violent crime statistic story. I think it's important to think about it in terms of a social order, and just thinking about policing as not just the only solution, but also as like part of this team of nonprofits, gang members, and political leaders, and all of them working to prevent things from breaking out and reaching to the point of homicides. And just in the East Side, it was just virtually a free-for-all, where there was absolutely no connections. And I think you see pockets of that all over the city. I mean, and I think you can see those. You could see that variation going from neighborhood to neighborhood, and see like how police are coming out to events with organizers in certain blocks, and then you just walk a few blocks down, and there are areas that even the police feel very hesitant to even enter in by themselves. Related, the 2016 crime spike, violent crime spike, it's really tough to pin down methodologically. I think you would need more time to pass to be able to get a full sense of where where violent crime has increased and remained stable. But my sense is that it's those years were kind of like a perfect soup for the resurgence of violence. You had the state budget crisis, where organizations, and not just violence prevention, but all sorts of other social services were just frozen. You had the police legitimacy crisis with Laquan McDonald. And at the same time, people writing about the rise of social media and like how beefs are unfolding over social media. And in my eyes, those are just sort of like if you wanted to design the perfect conditions to ignite violence, I mean, it's hard to think of a better set of conditions. And I think it's in part those overlapping features. I think more time will tell before we know definitively. I don't know who's.
So I've been interested in neighborhood, collective efficacy for a long time. The idea that people who are living in a neighborhood can rely on each other to intervene and to protect public order. The big question has been, how do you create it? That's been the big puzzle, and I'm thinking maybe your book has a really good answer to that. And I wonder whether part of the answer has to do with the political mobilization. Not so much just the fact that you have leaders who are operating in good ways, but the sustained struggle that people in the West Village, Little Village, participated in for many years. Was it through their relationships of struggle together politically that they were able to form ties that were important in protecting order? What role, I really am asking, not just the institutions, but really the political ties among the people who created those institutions in some sense might have played in this?
Yeah, I think one really critical example of that is the fact that these Latino political leaders that were fighting to get representation in the 22nd Ward were ultimately able to secure that by joining in on a lawsuit that was filed from Black community groups against the redistricting ordinance. And so much of the work of the legal work was spearheaded in African American communities that had been disenfranchised. And at that time, because there was this interracial coalition around Mayor Harold Washington, and Harold Washington needed more independent city council members, it was in part, I think, a form of collective advocacy that spanned neighborhoods and spanned racial lines, not just Black and Latino, but white as well. And to your question of how to create collective efficacy, I would say from my time spending there, it's more of a matter of removing the barriers to it and the institutions that either through intentional or unintentional ways are undermining it. Because what I saw consistently was instances of collective efficacy, but they were often very short, a year before the police commander turned over, or the districts are redrawn, and then all of a sudden you don't know who your alderman is, and you don't know where the CAPS meetings are, and then the nonprofits stop showing up. And so what I saw repeatedly was residents doing everything they could to do something about it, because many of them had kids, and their priority was doing something to protect their children. And I saw that. I saw the power in that. There was so much of that going on, and I think it's a real positive energy. It's a real positive resource to be built upon, a parent's concern for their child. But what I saw was just how they would just go down the line and how it would be interrupted in all these different ways, or they would have a little bit of success, but then only have that disrupted. And I think the visualizations really drive that point home, right? It's could you imagine if they had that stability for 50 some odd years in the way that other communities have, right? Because we see that responses to crime in places like Bridgeport and Beverly do get handled very well and very prudently. And in part, it can because there's that stable set of relationships that span the city.
I want to thank you for giving the talk. It was really an impressive way of seeing the ways that space takes on social meaning and has very powerful social impact, or potentially social impact. I wonder if you can do either real analysis of another city or a thought piece of how we could reorganize the political system in Chicago that would have very different results. Or how could we take the Beverly example and make it citywide? Are there ways to reallocate power or reallocate community in a way that would change these counterproductive dynamics?
Yeah, my answer to that question is to bring in political scientists into the room. It's something I've thought about. In my spare time, I'll just read through papers and Google searches just to see, even outside of the U.S. context, right? Like, how is power distributed locally? And I remember reading this piece on Vox a while ago. I can't remember it, but it talked about how unique the U.S. system was of having this like ward-based system, whereas in so many other cities, it's not as clear of a zero-sum game. So in short, I think the answers are out there. I think we need to invite more political scientists and political sociologists into the room to help us make sense of that. And I would love to see more conversations, more productive conversations. Because as you can imagine, right, the resistance to that is going to be pretty stiff. But there were time periods, right, where lead was legal and cigarettes didn't have labels on them, and right. So I feel like there's much that we can learn from history and from political science to get at some of these questions.
I'd like to ask a question, sort of one with each hat on, sort of my researcher hat and my concerned resident hat. So I study the implementation of school reforms, and one thing that struck me is that often when we make a change, there is an intent, there's some kind of positive intent that's supposed to go along with that change. But then when another change happens sort of right away, whatever good things were supposed to come about kind of get washed by. And I'm thinking about these redistricting and thinking about sometimes there are good reasons to redistrict, to make wards more equitable and so forth. And on the other hand, you're pointing out these real life and death negative consequences. And so I guess my first question is if you could speak a little bit to that tension. How do you think about, we can't just say, okay, never redistrict again, right? So kind of how to approach that. My second question is, I'm curious if you have talked about your work with city council members or with community groups. My sense is that gerrymandering is something that makes most people's eyes just kind of glaze over. It doesn't seem very sexy. It doesn't seem like a thing I really want to march in the streets about. I'm curious what response you've gotten, and if you have any optimism about sort of community, like you raised the issue of mass movement, of kind of community organizing around this sort of issue.
Yeah, I completely agree that redistricting is something that can be done in positive and negative ways. And I would also say that at-large representation isn't perfect either. I think at the most basic level, it's useful to know that whether redistricting is done for positive or negative reasons, for police departments, social service organizations, to keep an eye out on the places that have become most fragmented and adjust resource distribution accordingly. I think there are all sorts of ways that algorithms are being used to try and predict the problematic behaviors of kids and whatnot. I don't see why we couldn't have a similar arrangement in thinking that, okay, there are inefficiencies that the system are going to produce. We will know that, there will be these problem areas. Let's, develop and be a little bit smarter about resource allocation. So that's just one way I've thought about that. I'm sorry, your second question?
Just about how do you, when you talk to kind of...
Oh, city council members, right. Right. Directly, no. Indirectly, yes, I have spoken. There are quite a few that are fed up with it. And they think it's unfair because there are some that are jealous of aldermen that have stable representation the whole time. For example, there's one alderman, who I won't name, whose ward is split up in like a Black community, a Latino community, an Asian community, and in their mind, that's 3 times the work that an alderman who has a stable set of political representatives that they have to do, and 3 times the headaches. And so I think that there's potential there. I mean, it's for very different reasons why they might get behind it. But I think eventually it would be important to have those conversations and steadily bring them in. What's worrisome to me is that when usually the redistricting conversations happen 2 to 3 years. So they happened in 2007. They're actually due to happen around right about now. Or I can't remember. Actually, it's in the 5th years. In any case, whenever these conversations happen, they tend to happen behind closed doors. And there's the Black City Council caucus. There's the Latino City Council caucus, and I think that I don't know how much of an incentive there is to bring those conversations out there, but I think that by bringing more light to this problem, because I don't think that these effects are unique to violence. I think I'm also trying to put together data sets on health outcomes and other sorts of outcomes to try to drive the point home that that this isn't just a violence story. I think there's probably other outcomes that this is affecting. And aside from city council members, there are certainly a number of think tanks and advocacy groups that want to try to turn this into a way to try to at least bring that conversation more out into the public. Because, like you said, it's not an issue that gets a lot of attention like police reform does. And so as a result, a lot of the conversations can go on behind closed doors, in part because no one's really wanting to listen. And another thing that I've thought about is like there's no real crystal clear translation of gerrymandering to Spanish. And I don't know anyone in PR, but I would love to like partner with the media relations person and figure out a way of how do you translate it, right? And I think that's another crucial part.
So that's probably a good time to transition from here in Medill School of Journalism, et cetera. I don't remember the full name, to reception. So again, let's thank our speakers and respondents again.